They called it refinement, they called it civility, grace, and the highest expression of culture. To the world, the plantation was a monument to Southern gentility, a place where manners reigned, where music floated through candlelit halls, and where every social gesture seemed choreographed to perfection. But beneath that polished surface, something darker stirred. The illusion of gentility was not sustained by moral virtue, but by the labor and suffering of those who had no say in the story being told. The elegance of the plantation house stood upon the broken backs of the enslaved, and every act of refinement depended upon the quiet acceptance of brutality. When we look closely at this world, Georgia in 1839, we begin to see how deception became the foundation of identity. The planter class built not only their economy on slavery, but also their sense of self. They invented an entire mythology around goodness and order, pretending that cruelty could coexist with honor. In their minds, the plantation was a reflection of divine hierarchy, the master as patriarch, the mistress as moral guide, the enslaved as ordained servants. Religion and social science were both recruited to justify what conscience could not. The Bible was quoted selectively. Pseudo-philosophers spoke of natural order, and so the illusion hardened into truth. The mistress herself was a central figure in maintaining this illusion. She embodied the performance of purity, dressed in silk, speaking softly, moving with an air of virtue. But hers was a virtue without compassion. Her authority in the home masked her complicity in its violence. She may not have wielded the whip, but her comfort depended upon it. Every polished silver tray she touched, every delicate perfume she wore, was a small luxury purchased with human pain. The tragedy of her role was that she believed herself innocent. Society told her she was the angel of the household, a moral light in a world of men. Yet her gentility was an aesthetic, not an ethic, a costume worn to conceal the moral disfigurement underneath. It is important to understand that this illusion was not accidental. It was a psychological necessity. To sustain such cruelty, the mind must build protective myths. The plantation was one such myth, a collective lie that made horror livable. The men who owned bodies called it order. The women who benefited from that order called it grace. The enslaved, however, knew it for what it was, a nightmare disguised as civilization to them. Every gesture of refinement was an insult, a reminder that the same hands that served tea were the hands that had been shackled hours before. And yet, this illusion persisted because it worked. It kept the social structure intact and the conscience quiet. It allowed the mistress to see herself as kind while living in a world built on degradation. It let the master pray on Sunday and punish on Monday. It permitted a whole society to call evil by another name. The greatest cruelty of slavery was not only physical, it was moral, a slow corrosion of empathy, a numbing of the soul. And that numbness was what made the illusion possible. If we think deeply about this, we recognize that such self-deception is not confined to the past. Every society creates its own illusions of gentility, beautiful surfaces that hide uncomfortable truths. We see it in the way nations romanticize conquest, in the way industries sanitize exploitation, in the way individuals convince themselves that comfort justifies complicity. The plantation may be gone, but the psychology of denial remains. It whispers that our privilege is deserved, that our silence is harmless, that moral cleanliness can exist without moral courage. To study the Mistress of Georgia in 1839 is to study the architecture of moral blindness. She did not wake each day thinking herself cruel. She likely thought herself pious, even good. But goodness without awareness is a fragile thing. It shatters when confronted with truth. The plantation mistress represents a warning, a reminder of how easily virtue can be corrupted when it refuses to look directly at suffering. Her gentility was a performance for a society addicted to appearances. Her silence was a form of violence, and her comfort was a confession of everything she chose not to see. When we peel back the myth of the gracious South, what we find is not grandeur but grief, not nobility, but the desperate attempt to humanize the inhuman. That is why history must speak plainly, even when it wounds. It is not cruelty to reveal what was hidden, it is compassion to remember what was endured. The illusion of gentility protected the guilty, but memory must protect the truth. And so, when we revisit the plantation, we are not just examining the past, We are confronting the parts of ourselves that still seek refuge in illusion. The task of history is not to comfort, but to awaken. We are called to see how refinement without justice is merely decoration, and how culture without conscience becomes decay dressed in silk. The genteel world of 1839 Georgia has long crumbled, but the human tendency it represents, the urge to look away from suffering that sustains our comfort, still demands reckoning. The past whispers through every system that rewards denial, every tradition that values image over integrity. The illusion of gentility is seductive because it offers peace without responsibility. But real peace is born only when truth is no longer feared. And perhaps that is the lesson the plantation leaves us, that civilization means nothing if it depends on forgetting. The grandeur of that world was built on silence, and silence is what gave cruelty its power. The time for illusions has passed. What remains is the responsibility to see, and having seen, to act. I'll focus this 800-word expansion on how the plantation became a laboratory of power, how the mistress and master both used intimacy and fear to maintain control, and how that system corrupted the soul of everyone inside it. Here's the full continuation, written in the same lecture, style tone as your first part. Power on the plantation was not just physical. It was psychological, invisible, and constant. It lingered in the air like humidity, saturating every conversation, every glance, every movement. In Georgia in 1839, power defined not only who could command and who must obey, but also who was allowed to feel, to speak, to exist without fear. It was not the whip alone that kept people bound. It was the manipulation of the mind, the constant reminder that their lives belonged to someone else. The plantation mistress, though herself trapped within a system governed by her husband's authority, learned to wield her own form of control. It was subtler, quieter, and in some ways more insidious. She enforced the rituals of obedience. How a person should stand, how they should answer, when they could breathe easily and when they could not. Every interaction became a test of submission. The smallest act of defiance, even an unguarded expression, could be punished. The enslaved learned to wear masks of calm compliance, while beneath those masks, entire inner worlds of grief, rage, and endurance remained hidden. This was not just domination, it was psychological warfare. The enslaved were forced to become experts in reading tone, in predicting danger, in managing the emotions of their oppressors to survive. They became masters of silence, interpreters of moods, readers of human weakness. Their survival depended upon understanding those who sought to erase their individuality. And in this cruel irony, the enslaved often saw their oppressors more clearly than the oppressors saw themselves. The mistress, for her part, mistook control for respect. She measured her worth by her ability to command obedience, to maintain the illusion of order. But that order was only a fragile arrangement built on fear. True authority inspires loyalty, false authority demands submission. What the mistress called harmony was simply the absence of open rebellion, a silence born not of peace, but of exhaustion. When power becomes absolute, it inevitably seeks to dominate not just the body but the mind. It must invade thought, reshape identity, and erase the sense of self. On the plantation, this meant teaching human beings to doubt their own worth, to see themselves as property, to internalize their subjugation. That was the greatest triumph of the system, to make people question their own humanity. And yet, even in that environment of total control, something refused to die. A quiet resistance persisted, the choice to remember one's name, one's ancestors, one's dignity. The act of remembering became rebellion. Philosophically, this kind of power reveals something terrifying about the human psyche. How domination can disguise itself as care, how cruelty can rationalize itself as order. The plantation mistress might have believed she was maintaining moral structure, that her control was a duty ordained by God or custom. But that self-deception shows how moral blindness thrives where empathy is unwelcome. Once a person begins to see others merely as extensions of their own will, cruelty no longer feels like cruelty. It becomes habit, a form of self-preservation. And yet, what such people preserved was not strength but fragility. The more control they demanded, the more their lives depended on maintaining that control. The mistress could never rest, never truly trust, never feel love that was not shadowed by fear. She, too, lived within a prison of her own making. Every act of domination tied her tighter to the very system she upheld. In her attempt to possess others completely, she lost herself. History often speaks of slavery as an economic system, but it was equally a psychological one, an experiment in how far human beings could go to justify inequality. The plantation was its stage, and everyone within it played a role, whether willingly or by force. The enslaved were taught submission, the enslavers were taught denial. Both were damaged by the lie that one human can own another. When we examine this period not through the lens of economics or labor, but through the lens of power, we begin to see its echoes in our present. Power, when unexamined, still operates by the same logic. It isolates, it silences, it convinces itself that control is virtue. Modern institutions may no longer use chains, but the impulse to dominate, through wealth, status, gender, or race, remains. History is not a closed book, it is a mirror. And when we look into it honestly, we see ourselves staring back. The story of power on the plantation is therefore more than a record of oppression. It is a study in human psychology, of how fear breeds obedience and obedience breeds moral decay. The enslaved who endured did not simply survive oppression, they survived a system designed to make them doubt their own reality. That endurance was not weakness, it was extraordinary spiritual strength. They bore the weight of power's cruelty and yet preserved a piece of their own truth. The plantation mistress, meanwhile, represents the opposite lesson, how those who believe themselves powerful are often the most enslaved to illusion. Her control over others gave her no peace because it demanded constant reinforcement. It left her hollow, dependent on the very fear she created. True power, the kind that uplifts rather than destroys, is born of empathy and understanding, things her world could not afford to cultivate. And that is where this story ceases to be only about Georgia in 1839. It becomes a meditation on us, on how we use our positions, however small or grand, to shape the lives of others. Do we seek control or do we seek connection? Do we command silence or do we invite truth? Power will always reveal who we are. It exposes our deepest values, our hidden fears, our moral center. So, when history shows us a world built on control, it does not only ask us to condemn it, it asks us to examine the quieter ways we replicate it. To study power is to confront our own reflection, and to decide whether we will repeat the old pattern or finally learn to break it. Would you like me to continue with key point 3 next? Keeping the same historical tone and philosophical rhythm, showing the hidden suffering and endurance of enslaved men. History often remembers the plantation through the image of the enslaved woman, the mother, the caretaker, the one whose suffering was visible and recorded. Her pain, though often romanticized or softened by history's selective memory, has at least been acknowledged. But the enslaved man, his torment, his inner collapse, his unspoken anguish, has been largely erased. His story did not fit neatly into the narrative of strength that both oppressors and historians later constructed. He was expected to be unbreakable, silent, and enduring. Yet beneath that forced endurance was a pain few dared to name. To be an enslaved man in Georgia in 1839 was to live under a system that attacked not only your freedom but your very identity. Every structure of slavery, from forced labor to the laws that defined your existence, was designed to strip you of selfhood. You could not protect your family, could not defend your dignity, could not even claim your own body as your own. And in that denial, a deeper wound was inflicted, a psychological mutilation that outlasted chains and scars. The enslaved man became both invisible and feared, both essential and despised. He was reduced to labor, yet blamed for his strength. His humanity was simultaneously exploited and denied. The mistress's gaze, the master's orders, the overseer's violence, all conspired to remind him that power did not belong to him. His body was used as an instrument of work, but his spirit was to remain crushed. And yet, within that suppression, the enslaved man carried a dangerous kind of truth, the knowledge of his own endurance. To survive such a world required intelligence, adaptability, and restraint, qualities rarely recognized because they threatened the logic of white supremacy. Silence became his shield. In silence he hid his fear, his grief, his rage. Words were dangerous, emotion could invite punishment. So he learned to communicate without speech, through a glance, a gesture. A song hummed low enough that only those who shared his pain could understand. That quiet resistance, the refusal to be entirely erased, was a form of rebellion. It preserved his sense of self in a world determined to destroy it. The suffering of enslaved men was not merely physical, it was existential. It came from being denied the right to protect, to love, to lead. Every instinct that defined humanity, to care for one's family, to defend one's people, to shape one's destiny, was turned into a forbidden act. He was forced to witness the suffering of those he loved and to endure the knowledge that intervention meant death. This was a cruelty beyond the whip, to bear the weight of strength, but to live in a world where that strength could only be used in silence. And so the enslaved man became a study in endurance, not the endurance of muscle, but of spirit. His strength lay not in what he could do, but in what he refused to let die within himself. He built secret worlds inside his mind, memories of ancestors and freedom, songs that spoke of deliverance in metaphors only the enslaved could decode. In the fields and cabins, in the hollow between command and obedience, he nurtured a quiet defiance. His suffering, though unseen, became the soil from which future generations would rise. The tragedy is that history's telling often failed to honor that inner life. The enslaved man was portrayed as brute or background, as worker or threat, but rarely as thinker or sufferer. His emotional depth was denied, because to acknowledge it would mean acknowledging his humanity. The mythology of the South could not survive if the enslaved were allowed to be complex, feeling beings. So they were rendered simple in story, faceless, voiceless, nameless. But in truth, they were the moral core of a society that had lost its own. To understand their suffering is to confront the full moral cost of slavery. Not just the economic theft of labor, but the theft of identity and the deliberate silencing of manhood. This was psychological warfare, waged daily under the banner of civility. The plantation was not just a site of production, it was a theater of dehumanization, where every role was written to keep one group subjugated and another blind to its own corruption. When we examine the enslaved man's silence, we are forced to rethink our definitions of power. The world taught him that silence was weakness, but in truth, his silence was strategy. It was patience in the face of impossible odds. It was a form of survival that said, "You may own my body, but you will not own my soul." That quiet dignity became the unrecorded heartbeat of resistance. It carried forward through generations, through the songs of the spirituals, through the coded language of liberation, through the unbroken faith that freedom, though delayed, was inevitable. Philosophically, the enslaved man's suffering reveals something essential about the human spirit, that dignity cannot be destroyed by force alone. It may be hidden, distorted, nearly extinguished, but it endures. Every act of survival on that plantation was a testament to moral victory over a system built on moral collapse. And that endurance is what makes this history not only tragic but profound. It reminds us that power can enslave the body, but it cannot fully possess the will to live and to remember. When we speak of the enslaved men of 1839, we must do so not as nameless victims, but as philosophers of endurance, as witnesses to what humanity becomes when stripped bare of all protection. Their silence was not consent, it was a mirror held up to the hypocrisy of the powerful, and that mirror still reflects. Their suffering demands that we listen, not to the myths of civility, but to the quiet truth beneath them. For history's greatest injustice is not only the violence itself, but the forgetting of those who endured it. To remember them fully is to see how much strength it takes to remain human in a world determined to erase humanity. And if we have the courage to look closely, we find that their silence was never empty. It was a language of survival, a song without sound, a promise whispered to time that no system of cruelty can silence forever. In every age, oppression reshapes not only its victims but also its architects. The plantation was not simply a place of domination, it was a machine that manufactured identities, some exalted, some erased, all distorted. The mistress of the plantation, so often painted as delicate and virtuous, was herself a creation of this distortion. She lived within the illusion of moral order while quietly suffocating under its contradictions. In Georgia, 1839, her world was built upon obedience, and to survive within it, She had to silence the better parts of herself, the instinct to empathize, the capacity for doubt, the simple recognition of another's humanity. Her refinement, her piety, her adherence to etiquette, all were shields against truth. The very society that taught her to value gentleness also demanded that she accept the daily degradation that sustained her comfort. She learned to call cruelty by softer names discipline, necessity, providence. In doing so, she surrendered her moral imagination. The tragedy of the plantation mistress lies not only in what she inflicted, but in what she became, a woman divided against her own conscience. Psychologically, her situation was a paradox. She was powerful and powerless at once. Within her household, she could command absolute obedience. Beyond it, she was bound by the rigid hierarchy of patriarchy. Her limited agency found expression through domination of those beneath her. Power trickled downward, and with it came the corruption that power always brings when unexamined. The mistress projected her own confinement onto others, mistaking control for freedom. Every order she gave, every punishment she endorsed, reaffirmed her fragile place in a world that valued her only for submission. This is how systems of cruelty perpetuate themselves, by turning victims into instruments of the same violence that constrains them. The plantation did not simply oppress the enslaved, it recruited the complicity of those who feared losing their status. The mistress's moral blindness was the price of her privilege. She could not afford to feel deeply, because feeling would unravel everything: the wealth, the comfort, the illusion of virtue. So she cultivated indifference as protection. Her silence became her survival strategy, her denial a daily ritual. There is a philosophical irony here. The very culture that celebrated female virtue stripped women of moral autonomy. By enforcing obedience as a feminine ideal, it trained them to accept injustice as order. The mistress, who believed she ruled her household, was in truth a reflection of her husband's authority, a living emblem of submission masquerading as control. In her attempt to mirror the standards of her world, she lost the ability to question them. And so the corruption deepened, not as overt evil, but as quiet participation in a collective lie. We often speak of slavery as an external system, but its roots were psychological. It thrived on fear, denial, and dependency, conditions that deform the soul. The mistress, confined to her narrow social script, learned to suppress compassion just as the enslaved learned to suppress anger. Both were acts of survival, but with opposite consequences. One preserved dignity, the other destroyed it. Each time she turned away from suffering, she surrendered another piece of her moral self until eventually there was almost nothing left but performance. To understand her is not to excuse her. It is to see how power corrupts even those who appear powerless. She, too, was shaped by the machinery of ownership, conditioned to measure her worth by how completely she upheld the system that confined her. The greater her control over others, the more securely she believed she belonged. And yet that belonging came at a cost, an emptiness she could never fill. Her refinement, her faith, her rituals of social grace, all were attempts to conceal an absence, the absence of moral wholeness. If the enslaved man's suffering revealed the endurance of the human spirit, the mistress's life revealed the slow decay of the human conscience. She was living proof that privilege without reflection leads not to peace but to paralysis. Her gentility masked fear. Her composure was the posture of someone too afraid to feel. The deeper tragedy is that she mistook this numbness for virtue. When we examine her story through a modern lens, it becomes a cautionary tale about complicity. Every generation faces systems that reward silence and disguise exploitation as stability. The form changes: factories, prisons, borders, digital economies. But the moral structure is the same. It asks us to look away, to rationalize comfort purchased at someone else's expense. The mistress's corruption was not a singular historical flaw. It is a recurring human temptation, the desire to be good without being just. History demands that we confront this temptation in ourselves. We are not likely to own plantations, but we inherit their psychology whenever we benefit from inequality and call it order. The plantation mistress teaches us that indifference is not neutrality, it is participation. Each time she chose ease over empathy, she contributed to the very horror she feared to acknowledge. Her story warns us that the price of comfort without conscience is spiritual decay. And so, When we speak of corruption in this context, we are not describing an ancient moral failure. We are describing a mirror. It reflects what happens when people mistake civility for goodness, when appearance replaces authenticity, when fear disguises itself as faith. The corruption of her soul was not sudden. It was gradual, polite, and perfectly acceptable to the society around her. That is what makes it terrifying. The real test of moral strength is not how we act when the world applauds us, but how we respond when truth threatens our comfort. The Mistress of 1839 failed that test, but her failure can illuminate our own choices. We can choose empathy over denial, awareness over illusion, integrity over ease. History does not demand guilt from us, it demands growth. If the plantation's false grace destroyed her soul, then our recognition of that truth can restore something of our own. Because every act of seeing, truly seeing, is an act of redemption. The further we move from the plantations of Georgia, 1839, the easier it becomes to treat them as distant scenery in someone else's tragedy. Time grants comfort, distance grants forgetfulness, but history does not dissolve simply because we grow tired of its weight. It waits beneath the surface, shaping how nations remember, how cultures justify, how individuals learn to look away. Memory is not a passive act, it is a moral choice. And the plantation remains a test of that choice, a question whispered through generations. What will we do with what we now know? For a long time, America's memory was curated to protect innocence. The grand houses were preserved as architectural beauty. The fields were romanticized as symbols of a vanished gentility. The language of textbooks softened cruelty into labor, turned rebellion into disturbance, and silence into peace. By rewriting the story, society found a way to keep its pride intact. But pride is a fragile container for truth. The more it tries to hold, the more it cracks. Reckoning begins when those cracks are no longer hidden. When we allow the light of reality to enter, it is not about assigning perpetual blame. It is about understanding that moral debts do not vanish when the currency of suffering changes. The plantation was not simply an episode in the past. It was a moral architecture that continues to echo in structures of inequality today. Its legacy is not just economic. It is psychological, cultural, spiritual. It shaped how people see power, how they define worth, how they decide who is heard and who is ignored. To remember honestly is painful because memory threatens identity. It forces societies to confront what they built their comfort upon. But this discomfort is sacred. It is the beginning of wisdom. Nations, like people, mature only through the courage to face themselves. Without that courage, progress becomes repetition dressed in new language. Think of the generations that followed those who lived and died in 1839. Many inherited wealth without acknowledging its source. Others inherited silence, stories half told, or not told at all. The descendants of the enslaved inherited wounds that language could not heal, and yet they carried memory forward through song, story, and survival. Their endurance became the moral compass history refused to follow. Every spiritual sung in the fields was an act of memory. Every retelling of pain was a refusal to let the lie of gentility stand unchallenged. Reckoning demands that we listen to those voices without interruption. It asks us to recognize that history is not a museum of artifacts but a living dialogue between past and present. We do not study 1839 to feel superior to it. We study it to see how easily its logic can return. Whenever a human being is treated as less than human, whenever comfort requires someone else's silence, the plantation's shadow lengthens again. Philosophically, this is about responsibility, the awareness that moral progress requires ongoing maintenance. Empires fall when they mistake awareness for completion. The work of reckoning is never finished. It must be renewed by each generation. To remember is to remain alert against repetition. The plantation system thrived because good people looked away. The future will depend on whether we have learned not to. There is also a personal dimension to this reckoning. History is not only a national project, it is a mirror held up to each life. Every individual has a choice between comfort and conscience. The plantation mistress once faced that choice, and her failure to confront truth defined her legacy. We face our own versions of that same decision daily, whether to speak when silence is easier, to see when blindness is safer, to act when inertia feels normal. Moral courage rarely announces itself. It begins with the small refusal to pretend. Reckoning, then, is not punishment, it is purification. It clears the fog that accumulates around truth. It restores proportion between privilege and empathy, between power and accountability. To remember rightly is to reclaim the capacity for moral vision, the same capacity that slavery tried to extinguish. When we gather the fragments of this history, the illusions of gentility, the mechanics of control, the silent suffering, the corrupted conscience, we see more than tragedy. We see instruction. History is a teacher that refuses to flatter us. It shows again and again that every structure built on domination eventually collapses under its own weight, and that every denial of humanity eventually returns as a demand for recognition. The lesson of Georgia 1839 is not confined to its geography. It is a warning against the comfort of forgetting and an invitation to the discipline of empathy. If we allow memory to guide us, we might yet transform shame into wisdom, guilt into action, and suffering into solidarity. But to do that, we must be willing to feel what the past tried so hard to numb. This is what moral evolution looks like. Not a clean rewriting of history, but a conscious engagement with its rough edges. Reckoning does not destroy identity, it refines it. It teaches that true civilization is measured not by elegance or wealth, but by the depth of our compassion and the honesty of our remembrance. So, when we stand before the ruins of the old plantations, or the records that describe them, we are not just tourists of tragedy. We are inheritors of unfinished work. To remember truthfully is to continue that work, to dismantle whatever remnants of the old hierarchy still hide within our institutions and within ourselves. Because the past does not disappear, it only waits for recognition. And the moment we face it without excuses, we begin to reclaim our humanity from the silence that once protected our comfort. The reckoning has never been about vengeance. It has always been about vision. The vision to build a world where dignity is not a privilege but a birthright. That vision begins when memory becomes more than remembrance. It becomes responsibility. And that is where history ceases to be distant. It becomes present, it becomes personal, it becomes a call.